Well, I am honored to be here. I am in the promotion pathway to associate professor, but I love coming here and being promoted to professor, because in all of the build up to Anna DeVere Smith, I was very attentive last week to what I could do to follow that up and to kind of riff off some of the things that were going on last week, which was just fantastic and very real. I thought you and Sean ran a really great moderated theatrical art experience. A lot of the teachers from one of the schools I work with, which is the kind of the GSE lab school, which is East Palo Alto Academy, were there. And so today I thought what I would do is reference some of that. I wasn't being rude texting on my phone, because I'm not that millennial. I'm a Gen Xer, I'm sorry. I'm a recovering Gen Xer, I own it, it's just what I am. But I was just looking at some of my notes last week. There were a couple of characters that Anna did that remind me very much of the people that we interact with regularly. So today, as part of this class for the workshop, I'm going to reflect a bit on our work for the last 15 years or so in school mental health, and particularly with East Palo Alto Academy High School and at about 8 middle schools in San Francisco Unified School District, who are participating in a 3-year, probably will be 4-year, because we didn't get quite as much data as we anticipated, randomized control trial for a structured intervention for students with trauma. That comes out of LA Unified School District. It's called CBITS. We're going to spend a little time on that. It was not in your background reading, so there will not be a quiz at the end of today on that. But I'm going to give you a little bit of science, a lot of bit experience, and I'm going to really just try to keep it real. So I invite you to, if you have an impulse to ask a question or raise a comment or share something from your own experience, please do so. And with that, I have this old logo here. Is there a new logo for the GSE?
Yes.
All right, well, old school is still cool, but I want to get the new logo there. So, the other thing on my acknowledgements here, I'm gonna acknowledge all of you to have patience with my Little League coach's cough, which I get every spring. My wife and I have 3 boys, different ages, 3 different teams, and we coach on all 3 teams. So not tonight though, because I'm here with you all. But the East Palo Alto Academy High School is a place where we have a number of, I would say, very committed, caring, passionate, inspirational teachers and staff. And I have learned so much from them as well as from the students and families over the last 8 years. We have a number of other school districts that we're involved with locally. And I mentioned the CBIT study, which is a collaboration with UCLA and SRI International. The other couple here, Palo Alto Unified, I'll just highlight some of you. Did any of you grow up in Palo Alto? Or did any of you, your kids did? And you, sir, when did you graduate?
2 years ago.
2 years ago. So, and did you go to Gunn or Pali? Pali. So Pali is Palo Alto High School. It's right next to the train tracks. Palo Alto High School and Gunn High School have been high-performing schools forever. One of the things they're really working on now is how to develop a sense of balance for all their students and for all their faculty. And that's always been in the mix, but it's become even more urgent following a series of suicides that occurred about 5 years ago. And in fact, next week will be the 5-year anniversary of the first death in this suicide cluster at Gunn. And prior to that, there were a number of suicides at Pali, which occurred over a series of years. But were not reported in the press because they occurred in a very kind of non-public manner, not at the train tracks. But this led to a number of collaborations and I think very positive steps forward that our team has had, that the hospital's had, that's really seen the district be able to heal. But they deal with a different kind of trauma and loss, those students do in Palo Alto Unified, than do the kids in general at EPAA, which we're going to spend a little more time on today. So the goals are going to be to highlight something called the Supporting Alliance. The Supporting Alliance was actually a concept that was hatched in this here incubator by Noah Feinstein, who was a PhD student. Did he work with either of you or any of you in the audience? Yeah, he's at University of Wisconsin now, and he was very interested in how do families of children with autism engage with science? How do they get their information? Who do the parents talk with? With whom do they consult? Do they go to websites? Do they talk to, their sister Ruthie? Do they, what's the way to get the best information? And what he found, not surprisingly, was that in fact, it wasn't the media or the websites or the therapists or the doctors, it was the teachers who typically had the most direct, intimate, one-to-one, daily relevant knowledge for how to really work with children and engage the system. So from that, we wrote a paper together, and it's now become the main, I would say, basis for a theoretical approach to all the work we do in schools, where we try and enhance the partnership among the important caring adults, parents, teachers, therapists / doctors, and then we've added some modifications to that, which include peers, because peers are the number one influence, of course, in adolescence among one another. We'll highlight some challenges and opportunities for using what are known as evidence-based treatments or evidence-based practices in school settings. And then we're going to spend a fair amount of time on trauma-informed interventions and why they're important for you all. I know about many of you, because I was here the first day of class to hear the introductions. I know there's some guest attendees today, but I think I have a pretty good sense. And so we try to focus the talk on what might be relevant for you. And let me just ask a housekeeping question. Do we typically have people ask questions in the middle, or we wait till the end, or? Yeah. Okay. All right. And we have till 7 o'clock? Okay. So let me acknowledge Lucille Packard Children's Hospital Office of Community Partnerships that has supported our work for a number of years. Stanford Society of Physician Scholars and U.S. Department of Ed. Those are my main sources of funding. And so, start with a busy slide for all of you following at home. I know this is being recorded, so you'll be able to read this while I try and not cough through it. The purpose of putting it up here is just to shock you into how many different reasons we would get called as a school mental health team to come and understand what's been happening in a child's life or in a teacher's life. But most typically, so I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I'm also a pediatrician. Mostly I hang out in schools and I try to understand what might be happening that could be interrupting or preventing a child from getting access to the curriculum because of a mental health reason. Mental health problems don't occur in a vacuum. They always occur in a context, in a setting. If something's going on in the classroom, probably it's telling us that there's something going on where? At home, in the neighborhood, in the community, maybe with a peer relationship. Maybe it's a fit issue with the teacher and that's all it is, but it's almost never just that. When I say common referral questions, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only referral question in a typical case. But diagnostic questions, is this child depressed? Is this the reason? There's a trauma history? Is it relevant now? Is there some other stressor in the child's life? Not post-traumatic stress disorder necessarily, but some other stressor that's interrupting access to the curriculum. When we talk about internalizing disorders, trauma and loss, this is kind of the main paradigm, the main lens we use in a school like EPAA, where the teachers approach their work with a trauma-informed lens. More than 50% of our kids have come from immigrant families where one or both of the parents do not speak English. Typically they would speak Spanish, or they would speak a Pacific Islander language as their first language. So when we're trying to engage parents, and we're trying to understand what's going on and getting a history. The use of interpreters become very important, cultural consultants, people who can really help us get the story. We deal some with suicidality. I would say it's not the most common reason we're called in, but at some of our school sites where they have on-site mental health support, they'll call the psychiatry team when they're really worried that this teenager is presenting with sort of moderate to severe presentation versus mild to moderate symptoms. Autistic spectrum, severe thought disorders. This is a common one. It's on the bottom here, but that doesn't mean it's the least common. Parent-staff adjustment to end of the year, for example. Teachers have been working very hard all year and are getting ready, looking forward to the summer. Most hopefully will be coming back, but some have been offered positions elsewhere, and some have moved on that proverbial spectrum from compassion satisfaction, which is the reason many of our teachers come into our school and other urban schools, to compassion fatigue, to burnout. And that's where we want to understand what can we do as a mental health team. So we do provide psychotherapy, but a lot of what we do here is teacher consultation, teacher support around strain of work with high-risk students, and then we have a number of training and research opportunities. Again, I promise this is the last busy slide, but it's just to show you that there's our charter school with clinical and research opportunities, our community and public school consultation services, and our non-public school services, which are focused primarily in two areas. One is Achieve Kids. Anyone hear of Achieve Kids? Used to be called Peninsula Children's Center. It's a school for kids with developmental disabilities, from 3 to 24. So most of those kids are autistic spectrum. Most of those kids are have Medi-Cal or no insurance, and have a hard time getting services elsewhere. So we're embedded at the school there. And then at St. Ignatius College Prep in the city, where they also had some deaths by suicide a few years ago, and we've been involved again with a national trial doing an intervention there. And so that's the diversity of our team. Now I'm going to move to the focus today, which is going to be talking a little more about the Supporting Alliance. So as I said, Noah Feinstein was a graduate student at the time, and now is at University of Wisconsin, and came up with this model. Very simple. It was in your reading, or if you haven't read it, you can look it up in the reference there. We've modified it a little bit. In the first iteration of the paper, we actually didn't have student in the middle. We had parents, teachers, doctors. And it came to us that, we're all working around for and because of the student. So the student needs to be in the middle. And as we started to do this work more, we realized we're missing a very important other piece, not an adult, but we're missing, anybody know what the missing piece is here? Right, the peers. Who said that? You were thinking that, right. So the peers, particularly when it comes to students in distress, are typically the ones who are the first line, right? The first entree into what might be going on with a particular stress student. And that gets into, we're not going to ask about if we have a student in therapy, we're not going to go to their friends to find out what's going on. However, I'll give you an anecdote. Last week we had a 16-year-old immigrant boy who was raised in an unidentified country in South America, and was brought here by his parents at 2. His parents are small business owners, very successful, but they don't have insurance. That's a very typical immigrant story. And they will soon, hopefully under Affordable Care Act, they will actually do that. But for now, he's uninsured. So he doesn't have regular medical care, but his friends were very worried about him. And his friends, 3 of his friends, went to the counselor and said, he's got a plan to kill himself. And this is just out of nowhere, but this is actually a boy who we've known for some time, but he's been doing very well. Academically, he's doing well. He's on the swim team, he's very social, he's on student council. But his peers were concerned. His peers went to the counselor, and they called me, they called one of the other people who backs up the school. And this guy was for real, and he was actually presenting with very severe depression. He was hearing voices. The voices were telling him to go kill himself. He was in the room, psychotic, hearing the voices in front of me. Now, I've not seen this degree of impairment since my days in New York City when I was training there. But, you know, he accepted the help, and we made a plan. We made a safety plan. You know, here we are 2 weeks later. He's doing very well, but one of our interventions was for medication. Well, he's uninsured. So what happens with medication? Well, he lives in Santa Clara County, and Santa Clara County can actually arrange to get him a hospital bed for you too, but they don't pay for medication. So how much do you think it costs for 1 month to start a young man of 16 on medication? Hundreds of dollars, yes. Anyone want to guess how many hundreds of dollars? 30-day supply of a medicine called Abilify. Have any of you heard of that medicine? Yes. Abilify, some of you nodding your head. So it's a medicine originally developed, released in 2002 to treat schizophrenia, now shown to be effective in bipolar disorder, and a couple of other conditions, symptoms of autism, some of the irritability symptoms. But anyway, you know, he was hearing voices, and so we wanted to start him on a very small dose. It's baby dose. We don't treat babies with Abilify. Baby dose, small dose. So hundreds of dollars. 300 to 500 from the lady in the corner, the graduate student here. That's a little high. But, you know, it was $830 for a month's supply for 1 milligram tablets. And, you know, typically a dose for a guy his size, he's an adult size, would be, you know, a milligram twice a day. This is a milligram, you have to cut him in half. Well, obviously they couldn't afford the medicine. I mean, his dad said, look, I'll do whatever I need to do. But this was, we had to sort of reevaluate and figure, well, is there a cheaper alternative? But the point of that story is to say, there's a lot of handshaking that has to go on before the teacher identifies a problem. They call a mental health person. There's an assessment. The assessment has the parent's approval. You know, the insurance has to get approved. The intervention has to be enacted. The medicine, if it is a medicine, it may be a psychotherapy, has to take time to start working. Well, we were able to do this in a matter of like 3 hours because, you know, we have a team, we have an infrastructure, we are set up to do this. But even then, at the end of all of that, we had the plan, $830. So we had to come up with an alternative, which I can tell you about later.
How did his peers know that they needed to go talk to them?
How did his peers know that they needed to go tell a counselor?
Yeah.
So I saw him on Tuesday. On the Sunday before the Tuesday, he was on the top of his 19th floor apartment building, hearing voices telling him to take his life. And because the voices were telling him there were some things he did that were, you know, not up to his standard, and the voices were telling him things like, you're worthless, take the jump, it's the only way, otherwise you'll disappoint your parents. His parents are very focused on his education. They're lovely people, they want to do the right thing, but they don't understand how does this work? Hearing voices, what do you mean? What does that mean? You're saying he's crazy? No. He's not crazy. He's your beautiful, brilliant, swim team, much-loved student boy, and he's got these symptoms going on in his brain. This is not a parenting problem. This is not a character problem. This is nothing you did. These are not evil spirits. This is something that is in his brain, and I can show you what I mean. And that would be the point where I'd either bring a model of the brain or, you know, this is on the phone with the parent. He texted his friend and said, I'm texting you to say goodbye. And his friend said, what do you mean? Texted him back. And he said, I can't stand these voices anymore. Friend said, I'm coming right over. They had a conversation. His friend literally talked him off the ledge. I mean, that's what he did. And then, so that was on a Sunday. On Monday, he didn't come to school. He stayed home sick. On Tuesday, he came to school. The counselor called me first thing in the morning. So that's how his friends, and 3 friends went together. So Can't make that stuff up, folks. I didn't actually plan to talk about that case, but I changed, for those of you following at home, I did change the details to be able to protect his story. But the major point there is to say that peers often know what's going on with their peers way more than adults do. And it's important to have a kind of stance and emote, a kind of openness that might allow peers who are concerned about others in distress to come and tell somebody. We've had numerous stories of this, Mindy, at East Palo Alto Academy with our social worker, Maria Jose, who is also in that kind of place where she will hear at another student, they've really changed the paradigm there. When you tell a trusted adult that your friend is in trouble, or your friend is suicidal, or your friend is now homeless, or your friend's mother got shot, you're not getting the friend in trouble. The friend's already in trouble. You're getting the friend out of trouble. And that paradigm has very much been changed at EPA in the last, I would say in the last 5 years. They've really gone in a very positive direction around this supporting alliance, trying to get these entities to work together. So these are bidirectional arrows because we need for the all the entities to be talking with one another. We kind of start here as therapists where we are aligned with the teachers. Therapists may be aligned with the parents. Parents and teachers, if you read that background paper on trust and the family-teacher relationships, what happens to trust as kids get older between parents and teachers? Does trust tend to get better, worse, or worse over time? And what are some reasons for that? Well, here's an example. How many of you have elementary school children? Does anyone have an, okay. What grade is your child in?
I have a kinder and a first grade.
Oh, perfect. And what is your name?
Teresa.
Teresa. I promise we didn't plan this. She's not a plant, but yeah. Teresa. So kinder and first grade. What happens when you drop your child off in the morning? You see the teacher?
Yes.
And you know the teacher knows you. It's like, Teresa, how are you? How was your weekend? What happened? How many of you are parents of high schoolers or have been? What happens when you are seen on campus? Security detail over, I've got a parent in the southeast section of the quad. What do you want me to do? You want me to approach her? Does she need to go to the office? I don't see a name tag on her. But right. So over time, what happens is as kids are, at least in the US, everything is cultural, right? At least in the US, where we're a very individualistic, not necessarily collectivist society, where we are encouraging our kids to become more and more independent, we're actually kind of being disinvited as parents from that conversation, except, as noted, when there's a parent night or when there's some parent education or something. But, so, in some ways it's by design. Some might say, well, no, it's actually by default. I think it's actually by design. We're trying to get our teens more independent, but unfortunately what happens is, for our kids, for the kids who come, for the kids that are at EPAA, for many of them, for kids who may have chronic medical issues, for kids who have mental health issues, for kids who have trauma and loss, where you need the parents as partners. The system is not really set up to engender the sense of cooperation. So part of what we have to do is we have to work as a team and enhance the alliance in spite of the way the current system is. When you have a small charter school with administration that really gets it, you can do that. But we've been in other charter schools, we've been in other schools in East Palo Alto where that doesn't work as well. At some schools it works wonderfully, and at others, and Linda's not here today, but Linda Darling-Hammond, who's very involved in the Teacher Credentialing Commission, has sort of overseen this. What are the standards going to be for training? Can we get mental health 101 as part of the credentialing requirement? Potentially. But not so much for teachers. I'm more interested in getting it for administrators. Mostly teachers get it. We can do some PDs in the beginning of the school year. If you can get the administrators to buy in and really understand what their infrastructure needs are, you're likely to move the needle. And we've seen that in San Francisco Unified as a pretty big school district. I mean, not as big as LA Unified or New York City, but many of the principals there get it. And they've either had some formal training or, more likely, they've been touched 1 degree of separation by someone with a mental health condition or a child who might have a need, that is their sense of urgency. So there are a number of partners and stakeholders here for parents, therapists, and teachers, in particular for teachers. All these different constituencies that are giving them information, needing information from them, working together on the team. But what happens to teachers when they are more and more asked to take on mainstreaming, right? Where there is a diversification by design, by civil rights laws, by the need for integration for kids to not just be pulled out and put into self-contained classrooms, which absolutely have a role in our school system. But for many kids who were always sort of reflexively put in those kind of self-contained classrooms, there was a thought that, well, maybe they're not getting enough exposure back into the mainstream. So that's where the role of collaboration becomes even more important. So it's another slide from Noah's paper where mainstreaming here increases classroom heterogeneity, stating the obvious, right? And something called instructional tolerance from that paper, which is the idea that if teachers are going to be charged with helping this very diverse group of kids to access the curriculum and learn how to think, then we have to find a way to help them gain the sense of instructional tolerance and have tools to be able to reach and teach these very diverse groups of learners. Or we have teacher stress, attrition, frustration, poor student outcomes. So instructional tolerance mediates this. The better the tolerance, the better the mediation, the less the teacher stress. And poor collaboration, so mainstreaming increases heterogeneity, necessitates new relationships with the other trusted adults. In this case, doctors and parents, or therapists and parents. We have good collaboration, we can build capacity, and we can increase instructional tolerance. If we have poor collaboration, we're going to tax our resources and reduce instructional tolerance. We saw this a little bit in the elementary school. The elementary school experience from EPAA, where our team was involved, but they didn't always have administrator buy-in in the same degree that we've observed, at least in the high school. I think there were periods of time where the elementary school was absolutely had it, and there were other periods where the teachers felt like they were kind of with their instructional teams and they struggled a bit. And this heterogeneity issue started to really tax them. And so, any comments about this? Instructional tolerance. Okay, so why am I in schools? Why is our team in schools? Why does LPCH Community Partnership care? We have dozens of really important childhood medical conditions for which lots of funding ought to be directed. So why are they funding us to be in schools? Well, this is where kids hang out. This is where kids live. It's their job. For Teresa and others like me, I have elementary school kids and middle school kids that they're there 35, 40 hours a week. And schools are actually the primary providers of mental health services for children. And this is by default mostly. I would say in San Francisco, again, they do a pretty good job. They have these wellness centers. They don't call them school-based health centers. They call them wellness centers. I'm going to the wellness center because there's so many other things you can get there besides just going to see a doctor or a therapist. It'd be much better if we did this by design and not by default. But we have 70 to 80% reporting among children who receive services. You have 70% or more reporting schools as the primary source of care. These are on big parent surveys about where their kids actually get their services, and only 25% in the general medical sector. We know that at least 10%, this is probably an underreported stat, are not progressing, primarily due to a mental health condition. And it's probably higher for those of you who work in our field, you'd believe that. And that we have a number of diverse learners, so immigrant children, 25% now growing in California, even higher for the US school population. And many of these kids are struggling primarily because of their developing English skills. So I'm not going to spend that much time on policy reforms. How many of you know what the DREAM Act is? So the DREAM Act has been something that when they list the policy reforms, they say that, well, that's one one piece of legislation that could really make a dramatic difference in terms of immigrant kids' well-being as adults and increase economic and social contributions to society. Those aren't always the ones that are talked about because it depends on what kind of political climate you're in. There are a number of things that can be done upstream before kids are ready to apply to college. Increased attendance in quality preschool, improved instruction in English, and increased attendance in post-secondary education, i.e. the DREAM Act. Many of these are California's kind of the big experiment of what we do here. Can it be looked at across the country? And there are some wonderful pilot programs going on across the country. We still struggle here in California with how to do these three better. And what we try to do is we don't try to be all things to all people. Our clinical interventions for our service really focus on beginning interventions before things get very serious, secondary prevention of more intractable problems, and hopefully promotion of positive psychosocial development. Psychiatrists now are very much in the business of positive psychology. In the past, I think we were always seen as, MDs, you come to us when there's a problem, but now the pediatrician side of me is delighted to see that there are a number of ways that psychiatrists can get involved, and we have a number of students in our lab and in our group, and any of you are invited, where we do a number of programs around depression education and suicide prevention in the schools with non-referred clinical populations. You're just regular, typically developing high schoolers who are actually really eager for this information in our local area. And these are not big-time commitments for any of you who are interested. They're 1.5, 2-hour sessions. You can come teach with us. We'll get you trained and we'll get you out in the field. So what's happened now since I've been at Stanford is there have been a number of empirically supported interventions that can be employed. So in fact, the interventions are not that hard to do. The hardest part about getting into a school is getting into the school. Yeah. So it's really all about the relationship. Last week, someone said something on stage, or maybe it was Sean or Prudence, something about, maybe it was someone from the audience, when did our metrics start being defined by the numbers instead of by the relationship? When did schools stop being about the relationship and being all about the numbers? And so the reality, it's both. You probably don't get the numbers without the relationship, but we often forget that in order to get to the metrics and get to the outcomes, nothing happens in a vacuum. So we, again, we've been schooled by what's happened at East Palo Alto Academy. One of the things that the teachers do at the very beginning of school is they make these phone calls, these positive phone calls to the families to get to know who is in their class. These are the teacher advisors. So the teacher advisors will have a finite group of kids that they are the primary advisor for, who then they can engage the families with. And we have a number of teachers who speak Spanish. We don't have many teachers who speak Pacific Islander languages or dialects, but we have cultural consultants who can help us reach out. But those positive phone calls in the beginning set the relationship up so that if there's a need for a call later, hopefully positive, but if it's not positive, we have to bring you in to talk about some struggle that your student might be having. You've already at least started a bit of a relationship, and you have a bit of an introduction prior to when there's a sense of urgency. It's a small example of relationships are everywhere. So we try to perform the relationship and try to understand better how we can get involved. And this paper, which was in a series of papers that you can get on the Stanford, you can get from Lane Library online, which was a part of a series of collected papers that I edited with Andres Pumariega from, who's now in New Jersey, was reviewed by Cheryl Kataoka. She was the primary author looking at evidence-based treatments in ethnic minority youth, which is kind of it's the now it's 2010, so there's an updated version coming out. But at the time, it was really the most comprehensive review of how do you adapt treatments that we know can work for populations as a whole that may not be normed with ethnic minority youth, and really look at, you know, what is best practice. And the good news was, well, there was good news and bad news. The bad news was there weren't a ton of studies that just worked with, say, unique groups of ethnic minorities. It's relatively hard to do. Part of it is you want it to be generalizable enough, and yet you're focusing on a specific community. The good news was there were a number of adaptations of well-known interventions that were time-limited and manualized so they could be used across settings with diverse youth from different communities. So there were a number of studies looking at particular interventions just for example, Latino youth and LA Unified or African American youth. And then there were some that looked at diverse youth in a particular study, and that the results were actually quite comparable. The problem is that counselors, psychologists, teachers, they may be unsure of their roles. Am I, you know, as a teacher, should I be recommending this kind of treatment? I know this treatment is out there, CBT. My sister gets CBT, it's working for her and her sister's daughter, but could it work for my student? I'm not sure. What's my role? I'm not a psychologist, but I play one in the classroom. This is what my teachers say, right? No, you really are a psychologist. You are. You don't have the degree, but you have all the training. It's all in the field. But part of what we have to do is empower their role. It goes back to the supporting alliance, the idea that the teacher is the main person, particularly for kids with 504 plan or an IEP, who really have the most information and the most relevant contact with the kids. And children, and especially teenagers, they may not be able to describe how they're feeling inside. They may not be able to talk about their own, they may not have the language, the vernacular, but they also may just not have the willingness to come forward and talk about what's going on. And why might that be? Rhetorical question for this group. But what's something that teenagers really care about when it comes to, what's a barrier for them to come to an adult to say, I'm really struggling with this, I'm stressed, there's so much going on in my life, I don't think I can do this. You have amazing, committed, caring teachers in Rachel's program there, and yet the teens don't come forward. Name some barriers. Trust, okay? Shame. Stigma. Reputation. All these things are so relevant. You know, when they're designing the new site for next year, it's not a brand new site, but it'll be a new site for our team, for the school. Where do you keep the mental health team's main office? Do you keep it front and center, right by the office? Do you keep it back in a corner somewhere where students can go kind of on the down low to meet with their therapist? 6 of one, half dozen of the other. You know, if you isolate it too much, it's too far to get to. Yet kids may feel safe going there because nobody sees them. On the other hand, are you furthering stigma by putting it far away, by not normalizing the idea that, you know, mental health problems, mental illnesses, they're brain conditions. They live in the brain. They're nothing that you did or your parents did. They're not a character problem. They're brain conditions. And we know this affects your learning. And that's why we have a mental health team in school. That's why I wear this silver ribbon. It's the mental health disorders are brain conditions pin. It's the destigmatization message that I wear every day. It's a modified medical model. Medical doesn't mean medication. Medical just means mental health conditions live in the brain, they affect learning, they affect access to the curriculum. And that is why we are in schools. So when we're thinking about peers, one of the ways we work with peers in the summer, this summer we're going to train 535 kids in Palo Alto Unified School District, summer school students, to learn something called QPR. Any of you heard of QPR? Question, persuade, refer. Oh good, 6 hands went up. That's really good.
That's part of STEP.
It's part of STEP, yes. So question, persuade, refer. It's like CPR, first aid for suicide. There is something else called suicide first aid, actually, but this is kind of what it's like. And so you can actually get trained online. And Santa Clara County, by the way, if anybody wants to get trained online, come and see me, because I can connect you to the person who can get you trained online. But we don't think teens should really get trained online. We think teens have to get trained in person. They have to do role plays. We have a very well-developed system now, which we're tracking over time around outcomes, to see what the differences are when you're trying to engage teenagers. It has to be real to them. Fortunately now, as we look at completed suicides among teenagers in our rearview mirror, we'll make 4 years with no deaths by suicide from Palo Alto youth. On the other hand, objects in your mirror may be closer than they appear. And so where I live, and my clinic side of my life, we see these kids. I shared that anecdote of that boy last week who had voices telling him to jump, or to go in front of a train, or to take his father's gun. We see these kids, but they're coming to us earlier. They're coming to us less severe, I would say, more upstream, because teachers, students, other folks have been more attuned. The one issue with QPR that is that I would like to highlight is that QPR training by itself is not enough. There's a big data set in Georgia looking at 4,000 community members who were trained in QPR, adults and teens. And it turned out that they actually improved their knowledge and awareness of depression and suicide, signs and symptoms. But it did not result in any greater behavior change of teens going to adults. So you still have the idea of teens over here, adults over here, but the teens are still not going to adults. We found that in our data set of the last 2 years at 4 schools. Teens think that they would go get help for a friend. 75 to 90% endorsed from 9 to 12, grades 9 through 12, they would get help for a friend who was suicidal, even if their friend told them to keep it a secret. What percent of kids would themselves go to get help, by contrast? 49% tops. So there's still this issue. Prudence said this just a minute ago, there's stigma. And so peers may be unaware of signs and symptoms, and they, even if they're aware, they may or may not go for themselves, but we're seeing them go for their peers. And so what we're doing now in one of our studies is we're looking at what are the barriers to help seeking, what are the opportunities, and are there cultural variables that are mediating whether or not they would go get help from a trusted adult. And we are finding some very interesting cultural patterns, which may be the subject of another talk at some other time. Yes, Alexis.
I'm talking about help seeking from adults and thinking about, so you're talking about training teachers and training teens, and in my experience with teaching, some parents don't want their students to get help because of the stigma, which, culturally, a lot
Yes.
of minorities, populations, there's a lot of stigma in the community around it. So I'm wondering, what is there training that you all are giving to parents? Or what are some of the strategies that you all do with parents, and is there teacher training around that to help with this?
I am so glad you asked me that. Okay, even though we're doing a project together, I promise that was not planned. She just asked that question. So the answer is yes and yes. We are training teachers about what vernacular you use to train parents. I'll give you train parents. I'm sorry. Don't interpret that. Engage parents. Okay. I think some teachers would say we're trying to train our parents, but no, we're trying to engage them. And then, several of the one of the interventions I'm going to highlight in a few minutes here, CBITS, does have an intentional parent component that is very, very focused on that message that you're talking about, destigmatization. CBITS, the CBITS program, has 2 parent sessions, at least 2. We usually do more than 2, and then 1 teacher session. And some of these strategies are discussed in that forum. But when it comes to suicide prevention, when it comes to mental health, when it comes to, the parent who feels like, why my child is already struggling in school, why would you want to interrupt instructional time to pull them out to see them in therapy? That's going to make them more depressed. Their grades are going to go down. They're barely passing now. Well, some of that yes is the answer. We don't want to pull them out and make them more stressed. We have to meet with them at other times, lunch, before school, after school, during advisory. which is often when we'll meet with them at our high school at EPAA. But there are, and now I would say the standard of any school-based intervention is parent component, teacher component, because we don't do this treatment in a vacuum. We may be in schools, we may be in their system of care and where they live, but if we're not generalizing across settings, I mean, we're only there a finite amount of time. Teachers are spending all this time. We're not trying to turn teachers into therapists, but we're trying to help them with strategies once they know a little bit about the background for engaging not only the student but also the parent. So very important point. Okay, other challenges, school personnel often experience parents and doctors as barriers. This was in that trust paper, especially over time. Parents and doctors may hold similar views of school personnel. And again, those kids with IEPs and who have SSTs, these are our kids. This is the modern step-down unit. When we used to have inpatient units, Children's Hospital at Stanford back in the day, and we had our day treatment program, these kids are really the kids who are uniquely ours. And that's why with special ed teachers in particular, we have this unique partnership where they're often really at the front line of everything going on with the family and the child. Prudence.
Will you tell us what an IEP and an SST are for those of us who don't know?
Yeah, so an IEP is an individualized education plan, which has come as the result of this law called IDEA, sometimes referred to as IDEIA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education and Improvement Act, and the SST is the Student Study Team. Student Study Team or Student Support Team is typically the first level of intervention after something called RTI, which is Response to Intervention, where a team comes together where a parent can say, look, I'm concerned about my son, he's not performing up to standard, or he's having trouble in class, or I'm about his learning, can we have a meeting to talk about this, okay? I, Shashank Joshi, am concerned about my 11-year-old son, Anand, because of A, B, C, and D. Can we please have a meeting to talk about his learning? Thank you, I look forward to your response. Sign it, date it, it is now a legal document. And I have to hear back from the school in 2 weeks that they received this and they're going to schedule a meeting. That is particularly empowering for parents who don't speak English, who aren't sure that they have rights. And in the pediatrician's office or in the child psychiatrist's office, we talk about, and we have sample letters on our training websites about, well, here's what you do. Here's how you can be an advocate today, right now in your clinic. You've got a child who's struggling, we need a meeting, here's what you do. So these are the kids with IEPs and SSTs. And of course, psychiatrists and other mental health providers are often difficult to reach. This is why I gave Prudence my cell phone number after when I saw you at the first class, because I missed an email from her, like back in November. I was so embarrassed, but now you have my cell number, so best way to reach me. So, trauma. We're moving to trauma now. Trauma's impact on students. We know, I'm going to state the obvious here now for those of you in the audience, that trauma is not good for students, it's not good for learning, it's not good for life. But as it relates to this workshop on poverty, inequality, and education, there are robust outcomes now looking at these different metrics. IQ, reading ability, grade point average, rates of high school graduation, expulsions, suspensions. Even a single exposure can cause these symptoms here. Intrusive thoughts, interrupted sleep, nightmares, maybe what you see after a large crisis, an accident, a disaster. Chronic exposure can really adversely affect other parts of what are crucial for learning: attention, memory, cognition, reduction in ability to focus, organize, processing, problem solving, and ultimately this overwhelming feeling of frustration and anxiety. So why is it relevant for us as teachers or people who care about teaching? Well, there are direct effects in the classroom. How might this look like in class? Well, a student may fail to understand directions. They may overreact to everyday comments made by the teacher or criticism from teachers and peers. something that might have been an offhand comment that wasn't meant to be a critique might be perceived as negative. Noises, they may be more sensitive to bells and slamming doors. Physical contact, even innocuous physical contact. We had this extraordinary situation with a student at our high school where Mr. Camarillo put his hand on the student to try and calm him down. We later learned the student has PTSD because of chronic trauma and loss in his life, and he had the most dramatic opposite response that you would imagine. Instead of feeling calmed, he got activated, and then a series of almost very tragic events happened, but the school knew exactly what to do and was able to calm the situation down. Difficulty with authority and redirection, misreading context, etc. I think these symptoms may look familiar to some of you who've worked with this before. So there are now, and the good news is, in the face of all of this, there are now a number of studies that have come out looking at what can educators do to engage these kids. I'm going to pass a book around, a book I wish I had written, but I didn't, but was fortunately pointed out to me by none other than my dear colleague Joyce Dorado from the UCSF Healing Hearts program. Susan Craig's a psychologist, and she's written about strategies for reaching and teaching kids who may have suffered either post-traumatic stress disorder or who've had some kind of trauma. I'm just passing that out. We use that book as part of the PD with the teachers in our school. So what do we want to do? We want to restore developmental progress, right? We can model, we can teach affect regulation. Actually, Alexis is involved in a project looking at something called brain drivers education. It's like driver's ed, but it's a driver's ed for the brain. And it's a 6-lesson curriculum that comes out of the Harvard School Psychiatry program. We're trying to model appropriate boundaries, have the teachers own the idea that they may be the most consistent adult in that child or teenager's life, and to create a sense of a safe environment to learn. The school relationship is so important because this is where you've got the caring adult. I'm reminded of one student who just got out of juvenile hall, who basically is, living on his own at this point because, his parents have died, his grandparents have died, all the aunts and uncles have either died or in jail. He is at school every day. He's the first one in school. He's always there in some after-school program, and he is so connected. I mean, his life has been all about trauma and loss. But he comes back to school, and it was the first place he came after he came out of juvenile hall, and he is loved at our school. He's someone who has a lot of connections. And now what he and many others like him struggle with is, what happens after graduation? What do I do? Well, there may be a kind of an undoing of your academic success in order to not have to graduate so you can stay connected at school, and we've seen that happen a number of times. This last part here, partnering with parents and guardians. In the program I'm going to highlight in a minute here, the CBITS program, parents who may be struggling with symptoms of trauma themselves, much more the rule than the exception. Anxiety disorders tend to run in packs. They run genetically, but they also run together socially. If someone suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, they likely suffer from some other kind of anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, OCD, any of a number of other disorders. So with parents, some of what we're doing in the CBITS group is we meet with parents. It's really all about psychoeducation. What is trauma? How does it affect you in your life? How does it affect the brain? And what can you do about it? How do you adjust? What are we doing with the children in the school, without talking about the specific things going on in the group, but we talk about, here are the skills that we are teaching in order to help the kids generalize to other social situations, in order to help them in a way digest the trauma that's happened to them. And then teaching students about self-regulation, calming of emotions and behavior, and showing them that they may feel like they don't have control over a lot of things in their life, but they actually can take control of some of their emotions. There are a number of schools now in urban districts looking at mindfulness and looking at yoga and some of you may have seen the program that was highlighted in our department on PBS last week and on NPR, Dr. Victor Carrion's intervention with second and third graders in East Palo Alto. So at our school, Karen McDonald is running this as an elective and has collected some qualitative data and is going to be collecting other outcomes this year. So what does it mean to use a trauma lens? Trauma lens is shifting your focus from simply looking at the behaviors as behaviors to trying to understand where the behaviors came from. And what is the context of the behavior? What is wrong with this student to what has this student been through? Because that is going to inform how you interact. That is going to inform what you say, what you do, how you are with a particular student. So I'm going to take a pause here. We have a half hour left. I'm going to show you a 9-minute DVD that was put together by LA Unified.
It was just a horrible sight to see.
I never knew stuff like that could happen.
The day before I started high school, my mom found my brother and his wife dead.
I went into a bank. We were just standing in line, and there was like a holdup. 2 robbers in masks came in.
We heard like a gunshot. I looked up to him because he was like my best friend.
There was a middle-aged man who brought a gun and came to our school. We had to put the school on lockdown.
It was very difficult. Well, my parents did do a lot of drugs. My dad was the greatest person I ever know, and he left me just because of some stupid pill.
I couldn't believe that he wasn't with me anymore.
He was going to shoot the other gang, but accidentally shot his best friend. I don't want to go out of the house. I just stay inside.
Like, I've tried crying about it, and I just haven't been able to.
So the storm came, they were saying that the levee has failed, the levee has failed.
I was thinking that we were going to die.
It was real scary because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if I was going to lose my dad and my mom.
The water came through the house, and I was drowning. Then I didn't see my parents nowhere.
Things happen all the time, and it's not safe.
The image of the little school children getting to school and going to school and being happy in school sort of still predominates, like this extension of 1950s Ozzie and Harriet.
I think most people don't even, think that students have any trauma at all. They tend to think these things shouldn't impact them that much, that they should just get over it and move on. And that everyone's in school, in class, doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is generally not the case.
We've learned that trauma is far more common than we imagine. Across the board, not just in urban cities.
Some would argue that this is the most violently impacted generation that we've ever produced.
Things that some of us growing up in our time would have seen on TV, they see in real life out on the street.
The death of a beloved teacher, kids who have been in accidents,
direct trauma,
the kids who've witnessed accidents,
or vicarious trauma.
A traffic accident, killing a student.
Abuse from parents, and many times from other students.
The hurricane or the terrorist attack.
School shootings.
Witnessing physical assault.
Student suicides.
A lot of fights at home.
Just about anything that you'd hear in the news is what the kids are having to walk through to get to school.
When we look at children who are exposed to violence, we actually see that about 1 in 3 children may have some serious symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Following exposure to a traumatic event, parents and teachers are likely to observe the following things: preoccupation with the traumatic event, thinking about it over and over again, they can't get it out of their mind.
Every time I used to close my eyes, I used to think about what could have happened, what didn't happen.
I had some nightmares of like what would have happened if me and my grandma stayed back there in New Orleans.
When I was going to school, that's all I was thinking about, like what if one of us got shot or something.
The second major area is numbing. And by numbing, I mean trying not to think about it or consciously doing things to avoid engagement.
I just leave in the back of my mind
I try to blank it out my mom because I don't like thinking about tragedy, things like that.
Sometimes I just want to get out of school and not come ever again. I just want to be with my brother. Like, there's just days where I can't handle it.
And then the third major area is hyperarousal. That anxious feeling or constantly being on the lookout, being on edge.
Every night though, I always think about it and I get scared and I can't sleep.
I was up really late a lot of nights, just thinking about things, trying to think about where I'm gonna go, what I'm gonna do.
The effects on children are far more pervasive than adults imagine.
Remember, when you're 14 and 15, everything is a new experience.
They haven't developed all the coping skills.
And when they're new experiences, they tend to be more intense.
And so it impacts them far more.
And sometimes they choose inappropriate ways to resolve those feelings.
We think kids have behavior problems or they're not interested in learning or they're not able to learn, when really, when you get down to the bottom of it, there's some experience that they've had that has taken priority over, everything that's going on in their life.
Those experiences and those reactions that we have to seeing really scary things can impact everything from attendance to school behavior to test scores.
Attendance is never just about attendance, and bad grades is never just about a lazy kid.
A lot of times, what we perceive as learning disabilities or lack of skills, it has to do with what went on the night before, what's going on in their lives.
They're not able to study, they're not able to attend in their class, and then after a point they kind of give up.
During study time, like when it's quiet, I'll start to think about things and things will start to get to me.
They're on survival mode. Quite frankly, learning the periodic table is not the primary thing in mind.
It's hard to concentrate on your work, thinking about all those things.
The school nurses wear a white coat that says on it, "Healthy kids learn better." That doesn't just go for physical health.
If they're not healthy, both emotionally and physically, then they really can't attend to what they need to attend to.
I was an honor roll student. Now I'm not. I had like a 3.5. That was my GPA, and I was like a 2.0.
Nothing is as distracting as intrusive thoughts, sadness, anxiety, or pain.
The effect of trauma on school performance is well documented. There are many studies that have shown that exposure to violence affects school attendance, it affects graduation rates, they're much reduced, it affects grades, grades are much lower of children who have been exposed to violence, and maybe we just haven't done a very good job of communicating that.
Often kids have a sense that nobody else has gone through the same thing.
I had a couple teachers that did not get the point at all.
I don't really talk to them because they don't know where I'm coming from. Like, nobody understands my pain.
They knew what happened, but they never took it into consideration at all.
There's so much stress that I have and so many hardships that I need someone to talk to.
I believe that schools are a good place to start, let's say, the healing process with a lot of these incidents that happen.
Kids spend a lot of time in school. They're here all day long.
We're like their second home, and so we have to nurture them and guide them and deal with what's going on.
We recommend that teachers, certainly are observing their students, and if they notice a change in behavior, change in their work habits, a lot of times behind that is some very severe trauma.
And so we just ask teachers to be sensitive to the particular student and just give them space, but also indicate that they are available if the student wants to talk to them about something.
Sometimes I talk to some of my teachers because I have my favorites that I feel comfortable talking to.
These are the teachers our students talk about and say, that's a teacher I always will remember because they were there for me when I needed them.
Every kid needs to have, a couple of different options in their experience on the campus so that there's at least some place for them to go. And sometimes it needs more than a teacher. It needs people with more and better training or people with access to more and better resources.
We could coordinate the response from not just law enforcement, but also mental health professionals, teachers, administrators, and people within the community to start addressing some of these issues.
Programs like that, I mean, it teaches them how to talk, how to say what they feel. As a parent, we should have more of this help.
Once caregivers, teachers, and administrators understand normal responses to trauma, the experience of working and providing support to a student is a lot easier.
Now the good news is that with early intervention, children really can resume their lives and do much better in school.
In general, young people are open and interested and want to be heard and want to share. And we just need to lay the foundation.
So we are back to, we just put it all together. Now we're going to do a case example. And now one of my pet peeves is, we have a workshop and I'm not going to ask you to do any work. That's not really fair to you, right? Because you're here, you signed up to do work in this shop. So let's see how we do for time, because let me just, maybe Alexis, you could volunteer to read this case out loud. You can read it out, yeah, will that be a problem for the video if she
No,
reads
it'll
it?
be fine.
It'll be fine,
Yep.
okay.
Ryan,
Sorry about that.
Ryan is a 6th grade boy. This morning when he arrived at school, his teacher asked for his homework and Ryan did not have it. She expressed frustration at him, taking away his recess as a consequence.
Which we know is an evidence-based intervention, by the way, taking away recess. Yes.
Later, his deskmate accidentally bumped him. As a result, Ryan punched his deskmate in the stomach. His teacher, naturally upset by this outburst, began to yell at Ryan to stop. Ryan began screaming, kicking chairs, and hiding under his desk. After 10 minutes of trying to extract Ryan from the classroom, he was brought to the principal's office. He was then suspended for 5 days for his behavior.
I heard a couple of collective sighs as you were reading that, because unfortunately this is a familiar situation. This teacher's probably exhausted, and part of it has to do with, if we do the eyeglass metaphor, she's probably not got the kind of lens that would allow her to see this child from a trauma point of view. So we think about complex trauma and school functioning. As was highlighted on the film there, we know that kids can be easily triggered into fight, flight, or freeze reaction. The survival brain bypasses the learning brain. In other words, if you remember in the days of your science class, we think about primitive brain. Primitive brain is really freeze, fight, or flight. Primitive brain is kind of like our beta fish, which is in the corner, which when he knows it's time for a change, like he's in the corner huddling up. The survival brain. The learning brain is the stuff that occurs over time and developmentally and from an evolutionary point of view. As we develop higher order thinking, we are able to actually stop and think about what we're going to say or do. It's part of what we do in cognitive behavior therapy and in CBITS, where you first learn about relaxation and learning to calm the brain down so that you can access that learning brain and move past the survival brain. We know that relationships can be severely disrupted. We know attachment figures, whether it's a parent or a teacher or some other person you're attached to, can be disrupted. And we know that school behavior can be affected because of affect regulation, emotion regulation difficulties. So now I would like to highlight what happens when Mindy, would you mind reading Ryan's story through a trauma lens?
Okay, Ryan's story through a trauma lens. Ryan is a 6th grade boy from a highly under-resourced neighborhood. He has been witnessing severe domestic violence between his parents since he was a baby. One night, in front of Ryan, his father beat up and injured his mother so badly that a neighbor called the police. His father was handcuffed and taken away by the police, and his mother was taken in
an ambulance, sorry.
To the hospital.
Okay, so Rachel, can you continue on the next slide?
Ryan slept little that night, terrified by the events and anxious about what would become of his mother and father. With nowhere else to go in the morning, Ryan was taken by the neighbor to school. This morning, when he arrived at school, his teacher, who did not know about Ryan's traumatic experience together, asked him for his homework, and Ryan did not have it. She expressed frustration at him and took away his recess as a consequence. Ryan was upset and triggered by getting in trouble with his teacher.
Now, at this point in the discussion, typically I would have you break into pairs or triads and talk about what the teacher who is seeing him from the trauma lens, or maybe with the team, might be able to do, and how might this teacher understand Ryan's situation a bit differently? And secondly, what would it then lead him or her to do around the approach to Ryan? And so typically I would have you break up into pairs and triads. But given that we have 12 minutes left, I'm going to ask if any thoughts come to mind, if there are any reflections that come to you between Ryan's story straight up and Ryan's story through a trauma lens. What comes up for you? What suggestions can you think about, or what might come to your mind about how a teacher might, if they could see Ryan's story through a trauma lens, how it might inform what they do? What's your impulse? I know you're all thinking yes. Teresa.
Well, I'm having been a school social worker in a different setting in Chicago, right, and like having this be a really resonating experience. I don't see any room in which the teacher allowed for an explanation versus jumping to a conclusion.
Okay.
So that has to do more with teacher-student relationship building.
Yes.
Right. And then
So for the people following at home there, you're highlighting the first thing is the relationship. And in order to have a relationship, there's give and take. When you're the teacher, you're not going to give very much in terms of personal detail. That's something we work with. The teachers want to, but they have to understand that there are boundaries that are really important for kids to have. They don't need to know everything about your personal life, but there may be a little something you disclose about yourself that's very superficial and may provide some food for conversation. But the idea that you're highlighting there is that the relationship might allow the teacher to try and understand what might be going on from Ryan's point of view, or it might invite her to think underneath what's going on with Ryan. This is not my Ryan. This is not the usual Ryan.
Right.
What else?
And then, so the recess taking away in this situation was used more as a punishment versus an opportunity, right? It could have been turned into, you may not have had an opportunity to do your homework at night, given scenario, but the recess opportunity, I'm not trying to take it away from you, but give you an opportunity to do what you might need to do, right?
So that's a wonderful reframe, because then Ryan doesn't experience homework as punishment or having to stay in from recess as punishment, but really as opportunity to try and work on something. It might also be a time where the teacher can have some time with Ryan to try and get the story and try and figure out what else is happening. Anyone else? Thank you. That was very nice. Yes, Rachel.
So some educators would take this case and argue for not giving homework at all. Actually.
Yes.
Not,
right.
Didn't mean that.
So some educators would say this might be a nice example of why you wouldn't want to give homework.
And the second is as you started to say, as a teacher, I would think about, is this unusual for Ryan? And so, this is unusual, and know that this is unusual, then I would have to think about it.
I'd want to think about what is going on, what is up with Ryan. And this is often the most common reason for a consultation to our team. When a teacher has said, I know Ryan, this is not Ryan, something is going on. Yeah, it's a change, and he's not telling me. And I'm interested in knowing, is there anything else?
And then on the other hand, if this is the consistent behavior, then I need to be resourceful and ask someone for help.
Yes, so if this is behavior we see all the time, but now, I mean, he's under a desk, and now the kids are making fun of him at recess, and now it's gotten to the point where, not only has my instructional pace been sort of affected, and I've found ways to deal with it. Now I'm concerned that he's going to be ostracized, and then he's going to be at risk for other kinds of things, maybe bully victim cycle kinds of things. So that's very instructive, and if we did the workshop, you would share that out, and those are 2 or 3 really great take-home points. When we talk about the evidence base, you talked about maybe homework. Now there's a growing number of studies looking at what is the utility of homework. It has to be done correctly, or it really becomes a burden, particularly around Common Core and some of the ways that we're trying to measure what we do. The evidence base, I guess, has to always be introduced with this cautionary note, which is, you've heard this a lot if you're in the research world at Stanford, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Sometimes we do things in an everyday world. Greeting your students at the door and connecting with them has not, actually someone has done a study on that, looking at whether that helps to build relationships, and of course, surprise, it does. But there's not a ton of studies out there just looking at that. On the other hand, if you look at that as a way to build relationship with your students and have really the kind of command of your classroom that allows you to really feel efficacious as a teacher, well then that's one small step you can do to engage your students. So maybe that's not evidence-based, and yet we know it works. It's like jumping out a plane parachute. We don't really want to have a randomized trial with not having a parachute. So, but the evidence base now is growing in schools, and so CBITS is now the study I'm just going to focus on for a couple of minutes, and we'll have time for questions. It's been rigorously evaluated and effective across a variety of different ethnic groups. It's basically 10 sessions in a classroom for trauma symptoms. It was developed for grades 3 through 8. We've actually used it in the high school. And then there are 1 to 3 individual sessions for exposure to the trauma memory and for helping them to really process and, what we like to say, digest what happened to them. So there are 1 to 3 individual sessions, sometimes more. There are 2 sessions with parents. Sometimes we combine them into one longer session. In San Francisco Unified, we typically have the school social worker conduct 3 sessions, 1 for all the Mandarin-speaking parents, 1 for the Spanish-speaking parents, 1 for the Russian or Vietnamese-speaking parents. I mean, that's the reality of the situation there. And that works better for them. That allows them to kind of have a culturally more homogeneous group. And typically the interpreter could be a cultural consultant as well when there are idioms of expression that need some more explaining. There's at least 1 teacher session, including education about supporting traumatized students. That's usually done in the form of a big professional development seminar, but then we find ourselves often supporting, supporting individual teachers when we are working and pulling their kids out in group, not to talk about what the kids said in group, but really to bring up some themes so that they're aware of what's coming up, so that in the classroom they're cognizant of what's on the kids' minds. So this was developed in LA Unified, tailored for the school setting, and really designed to reduce symptoms of post-traumatic stress, not only PTSD, but just post-traumatic stress symptoms, other anxiety and depressive kinds of symptoms, and other problems. we have seen now, and this is the 4th year starting in the fall, there is a kind of grit that they begin to develop. They talk about this in session 10, about what they've learned in the group, how they can generalize the skills, and how they can better be supported, but also support peers and their parents who may have gone through something similar. Now, this is not to say we're turning the kids into therapists, but we're trying to give them a lens, again, through which they might be able to understand another child's experience. At many of the schools we work with, more than half the kids have had some kind of trauma and loss. And then they sort of look at certain behaviors from a trauma lens too. So one of the most important things we do is try to gain support from a school community for something like this. And that has to do with building links with the administration and with the really strong teachers so that there is buy-in. Sometimes we do have to pull them out of class. We don't like to, but sometimes we need to, and we have to weigh that against whatever they're doing academically. And if we have sort of partnership with the teachers and administration, that's much easier to do. There's a free website. There's a website where you can get trained for free, cbitsprogram.org, and there's a lot of wonderful resources there. Let me conclude with this slide looking at, how do you do manualized treatment in a time-limited way in classroom settings. I love this term, fidelity with flexibility. You have to have fidelity to the intervention, whatever's been shown to work, but as a supervisor now in this randomized trial, I've learned that, sometimes it doesn't take 12 weeks to do a 10-session intervention. Sometimes it takes 16 or 18 weeks because stuff happens in schools. There's a fire alarm, or 2 kids were absent in group, or they had some other thing they had to do in class. So it's really important for us to kind of not take our eye off the ball. We're using an evidence-supported intervention, but the idea here is that we try very hard to not make assumptions and really hear from the students, the parents, and the teachers about what really works for them in their particular school, particularly around trauma. So these are some websites that are some of my favorites. Anybody know what this is? Piece of trivia. This is a Brasenose College. It's the knocker when you go. This is in Oxford. So we got to present this material last summer as part of a big school-based consortium. And the last slide here is the NCTSN. This is an example. There's a whole educator's toolkit which we distribute and we do some training on with the teachers. So I'm going to stop there, and we only have a few minutes for reflections and discussion. So I'll invite any of you who want to share something, ask a question. Yes.
You talked a lot about interventions being culturally, models from different cultures, and you mainly focus on the difference between immigrants and non-immigrants. But I think we all know that there are communities that are, native to the United States that also have traumatic issues. So
yes.
Black communities and Native American communities. Could you speak more about if these tools have been found to be effective with those?
Yeah, great question. So, in fact, in the the African American community is one community with this intervention. I would say it's true for many interventions. With CBITS in particular, yes, it's been one of the first papers looked at culturally homogenous groups of kids, Latino kids, African American kids, mixed kids, and then Caucasian kids or majority culture kids. And they all had similar outcomes in terms of benefit over time. I think the generalizable point is that every kid we see, every case is a culture case. We really try, with our trainees, we try and get them to give us a cultural formulation on every case, and not to assume that culture is only defined by race and ethnicity. It often starts there, but it usually doesn't end there. So it's sort of an invitation. If you've worked with groups of kids, if you know something about cultural norms, it's sort of it lets you in the door. But once you're making the home visit and you get in the home of the cultural background of the family, you're dealing with an individual family, an individual and family. So then you have to learn what their kind of traditions are and their particular thinking is about getting mental health services. They may be from a culture that, I'll just use my own example, as an Asian American kid, born and raised in Green Bay, Wisconsin. My parents are immigrants from India. It was a very interesting experience. Other than the Green Bay Packers, we were like the only kids of color growing up there. But everyone lived together in kind of a mixed neighborhood. It was very interesting for me growing up as a kid. Our experience of mental health at the time, in the 60s, was kind of portrayed on TV. It wasn't something, we weren't having suicidal clusters, we were not having school shootings at the time. Fast forward now, one of our projects is focusing on Asian American youth here, and we see that there is kind of a, I guess, cultural norm among some Asian communities that, you don't talk about mental health needs outside of our family because that might reflect badly on us. Work through it, grit, it'll make you stronger, better. Well, that's not true for all Asian families, but that's something we sort of have to walk in the door with and say, all right, let's make sure we understand where this parent's coming from, because we know that may or may not be a barrier, but we may have to go in with our kind of modified medical model tools to talk about this not as a character problem or as a parenting problem, but as a brain-based problem. It might be more useful for some families more than others. So, long answer to your question, but it's one of my favorite topics. How every case is a culture case for every kid. With a therapist-patient relationship, we always assume that there's always three cultures in the room. There's the culture of the patient, there's the culture of the provider, and there's the culture of the institution. And so what is their experience of getting help from Lucille Packard Children's Hospital? Has it been a good experience in the past? Has it been a bad experience? What is it like to be passed from resident to resident, year to year? Well, if they've had great residents, maybe it's great, but still, it's kind of disruptive every year. Well, that's a culture unto itself. It may be easier to access and not as expensive as paying out of pocket, but it gets you in the door. So the idea of cultural adaptations is important for all of these treatments, because not every treatment, CBITS is an exception, I would say, not every treatment has been culturally normed. You talk about Native American youth. Our own Teresa LaFramboise has taken she's developed a lot of these programs from the ground up, but she's also been able to adapt some into kind of the spiritual and worldview of Native American youth. And even then, among Native American youth, it's so diverse because, different tribes have different worldviews, but you may be able to enter into a particular situation, one example being Sources of Strength, which is the suicide prevention program that we're implementing that was developed on a Native American reservation, because they have the highest completed rate of suicide among all youth, Alaskan Native and Native American youth. And so those adaptations were actually made for non-American Indian youth, using some of the principles but not all, because some of them were not going to have traction, particularly the ones around spiritual beliefs, because it's an important topic to address with youth. 70+% of American youth endorse some kind of spiritual life, maybe not formalized, organized religion, but having some kind of spiritual entree into how they think about the world is important. We as therapists often don't ask the question, so we miss an opportunity. The only way we know is if we kind of find out from that patient and family and student, what is their worldview on spirituality? Do they belong to a formalized religion or not? What do they think about? Certain thoughts and beliefs you try to tap into. Those are all, we believe, aspects of their culture. Great question. So, I think we are out of time for today. But thank you so much for your attention and your questions.